The signs are unmistakable. China is preparing to go to war. For one thing, Xi Jinping can't stop talking about it. So, for instance, at the Communist Party's 20th National Congress in October, he unveiled his most recent slogan, which is "Dare to Fight." And this message has been filtering down through the ranks. So, for instance, last month, the Eastern Theater Command of the People's Liberation Army, that's the command that will lead the invasion of Taiwan. The Eastern Theater Command said it was, quote, ready to fight. But Xi Jinping is doing more than just talking about war. So, for instance, he's implementing the biggest military buildup since the Second World War. He is trying to sanction-proof his regime. He is surveying America for a nuclear weapons strike. And most ominously, he is mobilizing China's civilians for war. On the 1st of March, China's reserve military service law went into effect. And pursuant to that, the country is now opening up national defense mobilization offices around this country. Also, last month, China's enlarged the pool of conscription, and that will include in wartime both veterans and college students. And China's actually serious about civilian mobilization. Last July, a Chinese entrepreneur told me, and he was making medical products for the civilian sector. This entrepreneur told me that Communist Party officials had demanded that he convert his production lines in China to make products for the Chinese military. The Communist Party had been issuing orders to other manufacturers, and the party, this entrepreneur said, was actually operating factories owned by private owners once, because those owners had gotten similar orders and had decided to flee China. They did not want to stick around for Xi Jinping's war. So the chances of war are actually higher than most people think, and it's sooner than we contemplate. In fact, one can say we're already in a war with China. Despite official denials, the Communist Party maintains this doctrine of unrestricted warfare. And pursuant to that doctrine, China has been using fentanyl to kill tens of thousands of Americans a year, to steal hundreds of billions of dollars of US intellectual property annually, to engage in predatory trade practices, and to foment violence on our streets. It appears the party is getting ready to plant invasive species into the United States to blight American agriculture. But now there is the prospect of hot war, what analysts call kinetic war, or what we are used to seeing in the movies. General Mike Minahan, who is the chief of the Air Force's Air Mobility Command, in a memo which was leaked on January 27th, said that in his gut, he felt that the United States would be at war with China, quote, by 2025. And perhaps he is right. So why is war could occur so soon? Well, there are three reasons we'll talk about today. First of all, the Chinese military is becoming much more influential inside the Chinese political system. Second, Xi Jinping has domestic incentives to go to war. And third, President Biden is making the United States easy pickings for China. So the first reason, China's military and its clout in the political system. The Chinese military is not a state army. It's actually a political army. And it has been able to militarize the Chinese political system. As a result, China's flag officers, their generals and admirals, are actually putting their stamp on diplomacy. They're making their what's called military diplomacy the diplomacy of the country. And they're also taking larger and larger shares of the central government's resources. So this year, China's military budget has been slated to increase 7.2%, but gross domestic product growth target is slated to be 5.0%. Last year, the central government announced that the military's budget would increase 7.1%, but the economy officially grew 3.0%. And in reality, the Chinese economy probably contracted. So we are seeing that the Chinese military is becoming so much more of a powerful force in China. And military spending is growing so fast that it has overtaken strategy. And now the generals and admirals are thinking about what they can do, not what they should do. The second reason is that Xi Jinping's domestic situation. Now, inside China, I think Xi Jinping is seeing a closing window of opportunity to achieve what he believes are historic goals, because the country is beset by simultaneous crises: continuing debt defaults, plunging property prices, a stagnating economy, worsening food shortages, deteriorating environment, and failing local governments. And also, we are seeing China on the edge of a long-term problem, and that is demography. China is on the edge of the steepest demographic decline in history in the absence of war or disease. The country, which is now about 1.4 billion people, this will probably end this century somewhere 900 million to a billion people fewer. And that means that China, at the end of this century, will be about 1/3 as populous as it is today. Last week, the UN said that India became, for the first time in at least 200 years, and some people think that that's first time in all of history, that India became the world's most populous society. So really what we are seeing inside China now is that people are getting desperate. And perhaps the most dramatic example of this are the Chinese who are fleeing their country. The most accurate numbers of Chinese entering the United States through our southern border are actually compiled by Panama. Panama looks at the number of migrants crossing the Darien Gap, which is about 66 miles of forest and jungle, which is almost impassable, which migrants to the US have to actually cross. And Panama in 2021 counted 77 Chinese migrants. Last year, the number was 2,000. In the first 2 months of this year, there were 2,200 Chinese migrants. According to other figures, it looks like in March, there were 3,000 Chinese migrants. Now, US Customs and Border Protection, they've got numbers, but their numbers do not include the getaways. But CBP's numbers are consistent because they show that there's been a 920% increase in Chinese migrants at our southern border this federal fiscal year, which began October 1st. Sam, and that's a pseudonym, Sam, a Chinese migrant who entered the United States in Brownsville, Texas in February, told Axios, the news site, this, quote, "This is just like a stampede, animal stampede before an earthquake." Now, the Chinese who can't leave are unhappy. And we know this because there have been a series of protests since late October of last year. Perhaps the most prominent of these are the protests that occurred after the November 24th fire in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. The Chinese people saw videos of fire trucks not being able to get to the site of a burning apartment block because of barriers in streets that had been placed there for COVID controls. And the Chinese people soon learned that residents of the block died in their apartments because their doors had been shields shut from the outside because of COVID measures. Well, the reaction of the Chinese people was immediate. There were protests across the country. And these were protests without coordination, without leadership, without organization. People took to the streets to protest, of course, the COVID rules that had been put in place. But they also demanded that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party step down. So it's clear that the party has lost support, not only among the poor, but also of the privileged. Sung Dong, who is a famous actress whose family is politically connected, actually took to the radio waves in December, and she delivered this extraordinary anti-communist party rant after her mother died by not because her mother couldn't get timely medical care, and she couldn't get timely medical care because of Xi Jinping's zero COVID policies. This showed that the discontent in China is pervasive because her rant was viral, and it shows that the Communist Party indeed has lost support throughout society. The Communist Party system doesn't work, and although Walmart and Wall Street won't tell you this, the Chinese people are saying that the Communist Party system doesn't work. Now, since then, there have been a whole new series of demonstrations. They're called the Silver or Oldies protests because local governments, some of them from poor rural towns, some of them from rich cities in the East, have not been able to pay their workers, their civil servants, and they haven't been able to pay benefits to older Chinese. So what is Xi Jinping's reaction? Well, the Chinese people know that he has no answers for this. Matter of fact, it's his policies that have caused this distress. So Xi Jinping's answer, I'm afraid, is to go to war. That's war to rally the Chinese people. And that is why China's internal problems could soon become our problems. Now, the third reason why war could come soon is because President Biden is not taking adequate steps to protect the United States. Beijing can see that there is a lack of sense of urgency, not only in the Oval Office, but also in the State Department and in the Pentagon. Now, in the Pentagon, for instance, the United States has not been supplying weapons to Taiwan as it agreed to do. Now, in the past, American presidents, and this is Republicans, Democrats, liberals, and conservatives, have slowed arms sales to Taiwan because we wanted to encourage a similar restraint from China. But now we know that policy has been a spectacular failure, and it's now time to change it, which means that we need to accelerate arms deliveries, not just to Ukraine, but to Taiwan as well. Everybody knows that Taiwan is not ready to resist an invasion from China, and everybody knows the United States is not prepared either. In fact, the Pentagon is making us less able to defend what everyone can see coming down the path. The senior generals and admirals and the senior civilians in the Pentagon have a policy that's known as divest to invest. In other words, to decommission ships and planes today in order to pay for the force of the 2030s and the 2040s. The problem, though, is that the risk of war with China is highest now, not a decade from now. Now, Biden himself has not been emphasizing defense. His proposed budget for the next fiscal year actually shows shrinkage of money for the forces after the effect of inflation. And he wants to try to cooperate with a Communist Party that really has shown in recent months very little interest in sharing the planet with us. Now, in my lifetime, I have never seen such a fast erosion of America's standing in the world. And this erosion is not due to effective Chinese statecraft, but is to seriously misguided White House policy. So we should ask a question. Why is Saudi Arabia moving so fast into China's camp? Well, the answer is that Joe Biden, when he was running for president, promised to make the kingdom a pariah over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And so now the crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is retaliating. And he's retaliating by moving into China's good graces. Question: why are the other 5 members of the Gulf Cooperation Council again abandoning their longtime friend, the United States, and becoming Chinese friends? Well, the reason is that the Biden administration has essentially repudiated the historic Abraham Accords of the Trump administration and is trying to befriend Iran, which is an enemy to most of the GCC countries. Brazil Why is Brazil ditching the dollar? Well, Biden actually worked for the election of Lula da Silva. And now Lula in office, is a leftist. And so he is moving to China, and he is making sure that the United States is no longer Brazil's friend. Why is Biden pursuing these America Last policies? Well, people do talk about Hunter Biden. In March, a spokesperson for Hunter's legal team actually said that a Chinese state company paid the Biden family millions of dollars as, quote, good faith seed funds. Well, that's an admission of corruption, because corruption is the only explanation why a Chinese state company would pay such money to the Biden family in these circumstances. But it's not just corruption. Robert Gates, the former defense secretary in the Bush and the Obama administration, famously wrote in his 2014 memoir that, quote, Biden has been wrong on nearly every foreign policy and national security decision of the last 4 decades. So whatever the reason for this is, we are seeing Biden policy actually undermine the standing of the United States around the world. And around the world, the United States is not in decline. We're in collapse. Now, China's flying a large spy balloon over our territorial airspace in January and February of this year shows China's utter disrespect, not just for the United States, but of course for the Biden administration as well. We've got to remember that that balloon sailed near Maelstrom, F.E. Warren, and Minot Air Force bases, where we have all of our Minuteman III intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's our entire land portion of the triad. That balloon also sailed near Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, where we base all of our B-2 strategic bombers. And it also crossed Omaha, Nebraska, the home of Offutt Air Force Base, where Strategic Command is located. And Strategic Command controls all of our nuclear weapons. So it's clear that China is planning either a first or second nuclear strike on the United States. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do about the way China feels about us. It's a bad sign that the Communist Party is not trying to hide its animosity toward America. In fact, it often goes out of its way to tell us how it feels. So in May 2019, for instance, People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, when People's Daily speaks, that's China speaking. In May 2019, People's Daily carried a piece that declared a, quote, people's war on America, a phrase that has resonance in the Maoist era. And since that time, there has been unrelenting hostility to the United States almost every day. Now, most Americans have chosen not to see the Communist Party's antipathy for us. But when they have, they've been perplexed. And we live in a democracy, so we don't think propaganda is particularly that important. But we're making a mistake. Why is the propaganda important? Because with these propaganda pieces, China is establishing a justification to strike America. James Lilly, our great ambassador to Beijing at the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, put it this way: China always telegraphs its punches. Well, right now, China is telegraphing punches. The Communist Party views the United States as an existential threat. And it views us as an existential threat, not because of anything that we say or do, but because of who we are. An insecure regime in China is deathly worried about the inspirational impact of American values and form of governance on the Chinese people. So what do? I have a 7-point plan, which also includes 3 additional points. First thing, we need to sever trade with China. We should cut off the blood supply to those who mean us harm, and we should not be enriching a hostile Chinese regime with our trade. Second, President Trump banned American investment into Chinese military companies. We need to go further. We need to ban investment into all Chinese companies because all of them are tied together by, among other things, Xi Jinping's doctrine, which was once known as civil military fusion, but is now known as military civil fusion. In other words, the military has access to everything that civilian institutions have. So all of these companies are tied together. So this means we need to prohibit portfolio investments into China. We need to prohibit mutual funds and pensions investing into China because we should not strengthen the Chinese regime with our investment dollars. Third thing, we should eject China's institutions from our country. This would include the remaining 6 police stations that Beijing maintains on our soil. It means closing the 4 Chinese consulates that remain after the closure of Houston. And it means stripping down the embassy staff in Washington from a cast of hundreds to just the ambassador himself. The other thing that we need to do is go after China's state banks, because these state banks are intimately involved in the laundering of the proceeds from China's fentanyl gangs. And that means the Secretary of the Treasury, in other words, the President of the United States, has the authority to invoke Section 311 of the Patriot Act to declare these Chinese state banks to be of, quote, primary money laundering concern. That means we can cut them off from their dollar accounts, which means these Chinese state banks will fail. Also, fourth thing, we need to stop China from using its nationals to commit espionage on our soil. And that, of course, includes journalists who are known to be Ministry of State Security agents. Fifth, we should cut off technical cooperation with China. And that means we should not be giving them the world's best technology for next to nothing, which unfortunately occurs. And this means biotech. It was American researchers who taught their Chinese counterparts to manipulate coronaviruses to make them more dangerous to humanity. And it was federal money that did this in a Chinese biological weapons lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Sixth item, we should prohibit China from buying our tech companies. And seventh, we should not permit Chinese parties to own farm or ranch land in the United States. We have seen these Chinese parties engage in very disturbing activities, including illegal marijuana grows, basing human trafficking operations on farmland, that's in Oklahoma, and perhaps for espionage as well, especially in North Dakota and Texas. I don't know what we were thinking when we allowed China to purchase our farmland, but the Chinese believe that food security is national security. We should take the same posture. In addition, there are 3 quick things that I think that we should do. First of all, we should sell our Chinese stocks that we may own. Now, we may think we don't own Chinese stocks, but if you own an international mutual fund, you probably have Chinese stocks in there. So tell your broker to sell your international mutual funds as well. Second thing, look before you shop. If you have a choice, don't buy the goods from China. Third thing, demand websites include cool information. That's cool as in COOL, country of origin labeling. Senator Rick Scott, Republican of Florida, is behind this. We should clearly make this the law as well. All of these steps take political will, which means bottom-up pressure, which means educating, which means grassroots organizing, which means electing candidates who will unwaveringly oppose China. Now, none of this will be easy, but what will our children and grandchildren think when they realize that we had the means to protect them, but chose not to do so? Each of us now has the power to act, and we must act because we don't have another country, and China is not going to give us a second chance. Thank you.
Gordon Chang, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that presentation. Awesome. I have a couple of questions, and we're getting in questions now, if you can hear me okay. You
I
mentioned
can.
you mentioned that that China's already at war with us, that we could move to a hot war or a kinetic war. What would this look like? Would they invade Taiwan? Would they try to invade the United States? What form does this take, in your judgment?
I believe that on the first day of a war in Asia, whether we're involved or not, that war will be fought on American soil. I talked about the migrants coming across our southern border. The war correspondent Michael Yan reports that he's seeing increasing numbers of males of military age who are not attached to family groups. And that suggests that there are Ministry of State Security agents and maybe even Chinese soldiers who are coming here to take down our grid, poison our water, assassinate our police officers, detonate bombs on our streets. So that's what war looks like. Unlike previous wars, Gulf War, even the Korean War, this is a war that Americans aren't going to know, each and every one of us, we're going to know that we're in the fight. But of course, we are going to see a war in Asia, which could involve Taiwan, could be Japan, could be the Philippines, as we've seen over the last 3 or 4 days at Second Thomas Show, that there is going to be conventional war like we have not seen since the Second World War. And it could involve China starting it by spreading disease. It could be, certainly it's going to be a war in space. They're going to try to take down all of our satellites. They are going to, I think, in a war on Taiwan, it's going to be a war involving Japan, because for China to have a successful invasion of Taiwan, they've got to have a blockade. For a blockade to be successful, it's got to be big enough to include sovereign Japanese territory. So that's what war looks like. But also one other thing, and that is just intercepts. I mean, this is the war where Xi Jinping wakes up one morning and says, we're invading Taiwan. But actually, I think the danger of war is more, not that Xi makes a conscious decision to commit an act of aggression against another state. I think it's going to probably be one of these dangerous intercepts that China has been engaging in, challenging planes in international airspace, challenging ships in the global commons, South China Sea, East China Sea. And law of averages says that as on April 1st, 2001, there's a collision, people die. And once that occurs, Jeff, we've got to understand that because the Chinese political system has been militarized, that only hostile answers are considered to be acceptable, which means that China cannot back down. And if there are American deaths, we should not back down either.
In the book, this is one of the questions that was texted to us. In his book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning, Peter Zehan, am I saying that name right? He discusses the massive growth in the money supply in China. They are printing multiples of new money compared to what the US is doing. They're using this money to buy influence around the world, property around the world, and obviously expand their military. Here's the question. Why is there not rampant inflation in their country? And why is their economy not crashing just because of all the new money in circulation?
Yeah, there's been a lot of money, and especially we saw this beginning with China's reaction to the 2008 downturn, where they decided not to have a recession. And so they went on a lending spree, and they created an amount of credit in 5 years that was equal to basically the amount of credit in the US banking system, even though in 2008, the Chinese economy was less than 1/3 the size of ours. So you can see that this has been an incredible creation of money. Now, there is inflation. I mentioned that last year, China reported 3.0% growth. And I said that the economy probably contracted. The reason why it contracted is because I think that the National Bureau of Statistics did not properly take into account inflation. But I think part of the problem now, and this is evident this year, is that China's been closing down factories. There's been a failure to really recover robustly from the COVID lockdowns. And because of that, that actually also, I think, mitigates the inflation in China. Yeah, they're printing a lot of money, but they've also got deflationary pressures as well. So really what we're seeing in China is a distressed economy. One factor here, and this is something that we rarely focus on, but that China's unemployment numbers for decades held steady. But we are seeing that youth unemployment is just off the charts. China admits to something like 18 or 19% unemployment of college graduates. And so you can see the problems in the Chinese economy. And by the way, that number is probably higher, of course. And Xi Jinping's solution is to send college graduates to work on farms, which is really no solution at all. So right now there is deflationary pressures as well as inflation.
I'd like to get your thoughts on the spy balloon. You mentioned it in your remarks. How much damage do you think it did to our national security?
This was incalculable. First of all, that balloon was able to pick up signals intelligence that they would not have been able to get from satellites. You hear a lot of smart people say, oh, you know, what can you get from a balloon that you can't get from a satellite in near Earth orbit? Well, first of all, you get signals intelligence that is not as readily observable as from space. But also, you know, the Biden administration said, don't worry, we jammed them. Well, the problem is that by jamming them, China saw how we jammed them. And that was also extremely valuable information that Beijing could not have gotten otherwise. And then there is, Beijing was able to see the reactions of commands like NORAD and the commands of specific general officers to what occurred. So that also was not available through any other means. And by the way, they saw almost a complete breakdown in the Pentagon. Remember, this balloon entered territorial US airspace on January 28th. The president, according to credible reporting, was not notified of the presence until the last day of January. Why did senior officers in the Pentagon, both in uniform and the defense secretary, why did they not tell the president what was going on beforehand? China, of course, saw that. That's disarray in the Pentagon. And by the way, if we think they cured that, well, I don't think so, because they just saw another large balloon cross over Hawaii, in other words, into territorial US airspace, and we did nothing. Now, the Pentagon says we have no information as to where this balloon came from. Well, first of all, the question is, why don't you have it? You should. And second of all, if it wasn't China, why hasn't somebody else claimed it was their balloon? So I think the balance of probability is that it did come from China, and the Pentagon still has yet to figure out how to protect the United States from an obvious threat, a threat that they faced just a couple months ago. This is a failure in the Pentagon. Every American should be deeply concerned, because clearly up the chain of command, where it counts, they have yet to be able to figure out how to deal with China.
We have a few more minutes of our interview and our discussion with Gordon Chang. If you'd like to get in on the questioning, please text your question to this number that you see on your screen, 980-290-1512, or you can put it in the chat function, 980-290-1512. And Gordon, I do want to read one of a comment from one of the folks on the call. He says, as a former member of Senator Helms' staff, the greatest compliment I could pay to you, meaning you, Mr. Chang, is that Senator Helms would be your biggest fan. Thank you for your fight for freedom.
Well, that's very kind and generous, because Senator Helms was a true patriot. He was someone that inspired me and inspired a whole generation of Americans.
A question that came in on the text line is asking, should we end strategic ambiguity?
That's a great question. And there is a lot of disagreement in Washington about this. Strategic ambiguity is the policy where we tell neither Beijing nor Taipei what we would do in the case of imminent conflict. And this was a policy that was developed when it looked like Chiang Kai-shek, who had fled to Taiwan, was talking about retaking the mainland. And we wanted to prevent him from doing that, just as we wanted to prevent the Chinese from engaging in hostilities by invading Taiwan. Now, strategic ambiguity has obviously worked, but it worked in a benign period, and we are no longer in a benign period. We see China threatening to engage in hostilities. They've been actually involved in acts of war against Taiwan, which Taiwan has just tried to slough off. So I think that we now have gotten to a point where we need strategic clarity. And by that, it means a clear announcement that the United States will defend Taiwan. This is what we do with our treaty partners like South Korea. And I believe that the United States should offer a mutual defense treaty to Taiwan. We should offer to recognize Taiwan as Taiwan. We should move munitions to the island, something that we generally didn't do with regard to Ukraine. And I also believe that we should base a small tripwire force on the island. Remember that this is what we did in South Korea. We have 28,500 troops in South Korea who would, in a conventional conflict, be overrun in about 3 days. But the North Koreans don't invade because they don't want to take on the United States, even though they know they could win a conventional conflict. So we need to do the same thing in Taiwan. Now, I know people are going to say this is risky, but the point is, after 3 decades of truly misguided China and Taiwan policy, every option that we face is risky. And the most risky option of all is to continue with policies that created this situation in the first place. So I believe that saying something risky right now is not a meaningful objection, because we have put ourselves into a disastrous situation.
The question that came in, how do you view China's current relationship with Russia? In particular, what is the extent of Russia-China military cooperation on Ukraine?
China, President Biden has a red line, which he's called lethal assistance from China to Russia. Well, China, from the very beginning of this war, has been providing lethal assistance. So, for instance, China has been giving Russia location data obtained from Chinese-made drones that Ukraine operates, so that Russia can take out the Ukrainian drone operators. But over the last several months, we have seen China sell ammunition and other high consumption rate items. Also, China has been selling drones to the Wagner's group. That's the Russian mercenaries. So that's lethal assistance. But when you look at it, China is providing more than just military aid. It's been providing diplomatic, economic, propaganda, support across the board. And China actually, I think, greenlighted the invasion of Ukraine, which is evident from the 5,300-word joint statement that China and Russia issued on February 4th of last year, just 20 days before Russia's attack. And remember, Russia's attack occurred just 4 days after the end of the Beijing Olympics. Xi Jinping did not want a war during his games to spoil the public relations aspect. So Putin waited until the games were over. That shows real partnership between Moscow and Beijing. Of course, on March 22nd, when Xi Jinping was saying goodbye to Vladimir Putin in Moscow after their 40th in-person chat, Xi Jinping said that change is coming, change that has not occurred in 100 years. And looking at Putin, he said, and you and I are driving this change together. So we can figure out how close the relationship is from that.
Communism fell around the world when people decided they were fed up with the government. Why are we not seeing that in China?
Because China is basically now a totalitarian state. It has moved past authoritarianism. It has the most sophisticated series of controls of people anywhere in the world, and the strictest series of controls other than North Korea. So the Chinese people, like all people, could be intimidated into silence. But what we saw, especially beginning with the protests in late October, where the Chinese people were just sick and fed up, and they just said they just didn't care. And so they protested, and they were in a series of protests. So really what we have got right now is a Chinese population that can explode at any time. China is volatile. The country is unstable. The Communist Party is able to keep a lid on it, but nonetheless, the party, I believe, is insecure And that insecurity drives its external aggression.
Here's a question that came in. Is there a way we can defeat China? The United States can defeat China?
Yeah. First of all, we can deter China. Let me put it that way. Even if China believes it could win a conventional war over Taiwan, which they probably could for various reasons, they're not going to do it because they're casualty averse. And they could not stand the hundreds of thousands of killed that they would sustain. So they're just not going to do that if they thought that we would stop them. Now, the most sophisticated set of war games that have been conducted in the non-Pentagon sector, in open source, is the ones that were conducted by this Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. There were a series of games in which the United States eventually won, but of course won after horrific casualties. But there's so many things that we can do to stop that war. And it's not only just clear declarations of what we're going to do. China needs us from an economic trade point of view. They need us so much more than we need them. That's not to say that severing trade relations won't hurt us. Of course it will, but it's going to hurt China far more. And we have the means to stop China from engaging in provocative acts. We just don't take them. And that's a failure of the part of our political system.
Should we be concerned about TikTok?
Absolutely. Two reasons. First of all, the one people focus on, which is China stealing the data of Americans. Every promise that TikTok has made is a promise that TikTok has violated on data security. And we know that they're very sophisticated at it. So for instance, those Forbes journalists who were investigating something, China actually found out the location of those journalists as the Forbes guys were trying to figure out TikTok. So we know that they're still continuing to use the data from TikTok. But the thing that is much more concerned is the algorithm that China uses TikTok to propagate its narratives. It has the algorithm to determine what our kids see and what our kids do not see. And China has been engaged in various uses of TikTok, which some of them are actually acts of war. So I mentioned fomenting violence on American streets. Well, the Chinese military did that through TikTok. You look at, for instance, the glorification of drug use, which is Beijing's project to weaken America. They do that through TikTok. They tried to disrupt President Trump's re-election campaign successfully. They did that through TikTok. Radio Free Asia reports that an intelligence unit of the Chinese military actually based themselves in the then open Houston consulate. And from there, they used big data to identify Americans likely to participate in violent protests in the US. And then separate reporting shows that the Chinese military sent them videos through TikTok. So TikTok's a national security threat. Why it is still available in the United States shows that the United States is feeble. We may think we're a strong nation, but we're one of the weakest on earth when we cannot defend our own country from known national security threats.
I have just two questions left, and then we'll let you have the last word with some final thoughts that I know you want to share. And I think you'll share something very positive, we hope. This is a difficult subject for us to talk about. About the coronavirus, is there any doubt in your mind that it came from a lab in Wuhan?
There is a little bit of doubt. I mean, to quantify it, I'd say like 98% it was it escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But the point here is not how it started, but what happened afterwards. Because we know something 100%, Jeff. We know 100% that once this disease got out into the Chinese population, the Chinese central government lied about transmissibility. They told the world this was not contagious when they knew it was highly contagious. And while they were locking down their own country, yes, lockdowns are controversial, but by locking down their own country, they were telling the world they thought this was an effective way of stopping disease. So while these guys were locking down their own country, they were pressuring other countries, including the United States, to take arrivals from China without restrictions. You put those two things together, and it shows that the spread of this disease from China was deliberate. As I said, there's still some doubt about how SARS-CoV-2 first emerged, but there is no doubt about what happened when it broke out into the Chinese population. China wanted to spread this disease. 7 million people around the world outside China have died from a disease that should never have left central China.
Final question for you, and we are so appreciative of your time with us this afternoon. The question is this: why do Republicans continue, or conservatives continue, to be so afraid of demanding action against China?
You have to ask them. I'm not a Republican. I'm an independent. I'm an independent because I'm disheartened by both parties. But this question highlights something which is important, and that is that some of communist China's best friends in the American political system, they're liberal Democrats and they're socialists in the Democratic Party who support China. But some of the most ardent supporters of the Communist Party positions are conservative Republicans. They're conservative Republicans because they believe in free trade. They do not believe in imposing national security restrictions or considerations on trade. And that is the Communist Party's line. Many people want a completely free and open society, a libertarian society. I get that. And that's great when you don't have enemies that are trying to destroy you. But when you do have those enemies, you have to take extraordinary measures. Lincoln took extraordinary measures to preserve the Union. We need to take extraordinary measures now because the attacks on our society are ones that could bring us down.
Fascinating discussion. Gordon Chang, thank you so much. I'll let you have some final words now.
Yeah. My wife always says that I've got to end on an optimistic note. So after 29 years of marriage, I learned that probably I shouldn't be arguing with her. So here's my optimistic story. And it's a story about when America was in a war. My dad got a scholarship from the Chinese national government of Chiang Kai-shek. And after a long way trip over the Himalayas and on a Liberty ship, he landed in the port of San Pedro, which is Los Angeles, in February 1945, just before the end of the war. My dad got his engineering degree in 1946. And right after that, the communist of Mao Zedong took over China. But a generous America allowed my dad to stay. My dad eventually ended up working for a public utility in New Jersey. But on the first day that he was eligible, the day that he turned 55, he took early retirement, took his savings and opened up a Chinese takeout in Madison, New Jersey, where he lived at the time. From there, it became a Chinese restaurant because it was successful. That successful small restaurant became a successful big restaurant. My dad took some of the money from the restaurant and bought a building in the town center of Madison. He renovated it, and he sparked the rejuvenation of the town center. Now, my dad never missed an opportunity to vote. He never missed an opportunity to tell my three sisters and me that America, China was his birthplace, but America was his home. He never missed an opportunity to tell us how wonderful his adopted country was. He would always say that China was his birthplace, but that America was his home. So the optimistic story is this, that I learned from my dad two things. One of them is that America is a great country, but the second thing is Americans are good people. And so I want to thank everybody on this call for defending the country that my dad loved so much. So thank you.